Okay, welcome to the 17th annual Durfee lecture hosted by the Department of Philosophy and Religion. My name is Jun Park. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion. I really welcome you to this wonderful event. Annual Durfee lecture was originally studied by the generous donation by Professor Harold Durfee and his wife Doris Durfee. Harold Durfee was a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion, and he held a position of MacDowell Professorship. After he retired, he donated money so that we can host this annual event in which we bring in very distinguished scholars in the field of religion. So today you will hear a really interesting talk, as you see here, the connection between religion and foreign policy, and especially in the first Trump administration. So before we move on, let me read a statement that acknowledges the original owner of this land. American University is located on the territories of the Piscataway, Powhatan, and Nantico people. We recognize that our ability to gather here today is due to the continued occupation of this land. In recognizing that this land is a colonized indigenous territory that has been crafted through slave and indentured labor, it is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate the histories and afterlives of these events and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. So now let me invite my colleague, Professor Nick Buck, who is the Director of Undergraduate Studies in Religion, to formally introduce our speaker, and Professor Buck will also moderate a Q&A after the talk.
Thank you, Professor Park. It's good to see everyone here. Welcome. This is a wonderful turnout. I'm really enthused about this. Okay, it's my honor to introduce to you this evening Dr. David T. Buckley. David Buckley is Associate Professor of Political Science and Paul Weber Endowed Chair in Politics, Science, and Religion at the University of Louisville, where he serves as the Director of the Center for Asian Democracy. His research focuses on the comparative relationship between religion and democracy. He's the author most recently of Blessing America First, Religion, Populism, and Foreign Policy in the Trump Administration from Columbia University Press just this fall. His first book, Faithful to Secularism, The Religious Politics of Democracy in Ireland, Senegal, and the Philippines, also from Columbia University Press, received the International Studies Association's 2018 Book Award for Religion and International Relations. He was a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in 2016 and 17, serving as Senior Advisor in the Department of State, Office of Religion and Global Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Buckley, whose Durfee lecture this evening is entitled Blessing America First, Religion, Populism, and U.S. Foreign Policy in the Trump Administrations.
All right, thanks so much, Dr. Buck and Dr. Park for the introduction. I'm really glad to be here with you all tonight. And thanks also to Therese for all the help with, there you are in the back, for all the help with the planning. Really appreciate it along the way. And also thanks to the department for the very warm welcome throughout this afternoon, and to the Durfee family in memory for setting up this program. It's great to be here with you today. Dr. Park did actually mislead you all a little bit. I'm told, I guess this is supposed to be a scholar of religion, and you have a political scientist right here with you today. I think, based on the website, maybe the first time a political scientist has done this, so there's a last time for everything, right? What I've tried to do in thinking about talking with you tonight is talk a little bit about the core of the book, but also talk about what political science can and can't teach us right now about the relationship between religion and politics and religion and democracy here in the US and also a little bit abroad. So I'm going to start out by talking about religion and US foreign policy and sort of the core of what I try to look at in the book. But ultimately, I think I'm here to, especially in this current moment in the United States and also globally, to think with you a little bit about the role of religion and democracy in an age of illiberalism and backsliding, both here in the United States and internationally. So I will start out by talking about the book and the kind of core of what I'm trying to get across in the book, But then spend the second half with some tentative observations, I would say, about the last 6 weeks or so in American politics, religion in American politics, and the foreign policy bureaucracy during these past several weeks. And then I'll actually step back a little bit to try to take a more positive look, perhaps anyway, at the potential role for religion in stabilizing democracy during these turbulent times. And in that section especially, I'll also pivot to a bit of my other research involving other contexts. So that is the overall goal. Okay, to start. So as Nick mentioned in the introduction, I was an accidental employee of the first Trump administration, right? And what I mean by that was I was an academic fellow working in a Secretary's Bureau office, tasked with advising State Department officials related to religion and politics. And that was an academic year fellowship that ran from 2016 through 2017. And so in November of 2016, I found out that the administration would change, and then it did in winter of 2017. And for that next 6 months or so, observed up close the changes that the first Trump administration brought to the place of religion in the U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy. And so what I'm trying to do in the book is to make sense of that change that I saw. Because, and one of the things that I'll try to get across here pretty clearly, is that it was more than a left-right shift. In other words, there were changes going on in how U.S. foreign policy was being practiced and how religion was relating to U.S. policy that were different than just when a normal Republican came into office, I thought, right? And so what the book is trying to do is kind of wrestle around with that. I actually thought that I might just read a little passage from the start of chapter 3 that maybe starts to get this point across. I won't go on too long, but I think this is helpful. So on February 27th, 2018, a reporter asked White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders about the administration's plans for governmental institutions related to religion, including foreign policy offices like the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, where I was working. This is to quote the reporter at this press conference. Quote, "The president's two immediate predecessors did a lot to build and expand the faith-based programs within the White House and throughout the executive branch of government. It has been said that this president has not followed through on that. Your reaction," close quote. Sanders' response perfectly captures the changes that 1 year in office brought to religion in the Trump administration, including the foreign policy bureaucracy. She said, quote, "Look, I don't think an office is what determines the faith of the administration. I think we probably have, actually, more people, front and center, speaking openly about their faith." Sanders helpfully points out that the reporter is not asking the right question. What is important is not a bureaucratic office, but the amorphous faith of the administration and an informal set of personal relationships tied to the person of the president. So in other words, the place of religion in the foreign policy bureaucracy was going to move away from being a bureaucratized part of the policy process to a much more personal component of the populist governance strategy that the administration was developing. And that's kind of what I look at in the book. What does this mean in practice? Well, I won't talk too much about what came before the Trump administration. That's in the book. But to briefly summarize, the approach to religion in the foreign policy bureaucracy, I would say from roughly 1990-ish through the Obama administration, was to make religion boring. What do I mean by that? To make religion a part of the policy process in the same way that a State Department official would think about economics when evaluating a policy decision, or evaluate security concerns, or other cultural concerns, or gender concerns, right? To make sure that the religious dimension of foreign policy issues was something that was understood at a basic level by American diplomats, so that we didn't make huge mistakes, essentially, right? So there was a bureaucratically approved handbook related to religion and foreign policy that the office published, right? In terms of the second act, things shifted to this, right? I don't know if anybody remembers this photo. This is a photo from President Trump's first term, his actual first international trip abroad, right? It's a trip that saw him go to inaugurate a counterterrorism center in the Gulf, and then visit Israel and the Palestinian territories, and then visit the Vatican. His first trip abroad was what was called by one reporter an excellent Abrahamic adventure, right? And it was not boring, right? Very theatrical, right? And this, I think, gets across a little bit of the change that we saw relatively early on. Okay, so let me talk a little bit more about how I analyze that change. In the book, what I try to argue is that the Trump administration's populism is central to understanding how the policy process changed. What do I mean by that? Populism is a kind of nebulous term, right? I'm actually curious how it gets used in the religious studies context. In the political science context, it can get used in a few different ways, but there are two that sort of stand out and I think help to make sense of the changes that we saw. On the one hand, populists draw boundaries around the people and demonize outgroups, right? Again, this is not just here in the United States. We can find plenty of examples of this abroad. This is a quote related to Brazilian politics under former President Jair Bolsonaro, where drug users and gangs and criminals in general were that outgroup, right? So the demonization of outgroups is a characteristic of populism, and also sort of defining who the people are, right? So defining the in-group, excluding the out-group. One dimension of populism. A second dimension of populism has less to do with the substance of policy and more so the process of governance or the structure of governance, right? So populists reject institutional constraint. They break down existing bureaucracy and govern through personal discretion, right? This is a headline from the Philippines from the term in office of former President Rodrigo Duterte. There's a lot that we could say about Duterte, and I'll talk a little more about him later. But in this instance, what he's done is jail the leader of the political opposition in the Senate, Senator Leila de Lima, on effectively fabricated charges related to financial indiscretions and allegations of involvement in drugs, but jailed without due process because she was the leader of the political opposition. And she was effectively held in prison for his entire term in office before eventually being released, right? Why was she held? Because of challenging the personal prerogatives of Duterte. She had led human rights investigations into his governance earlier on, and because of that was seen as a threat. And the checks and balances of the judicial system were not going to protect her during that period, okay? So this combination of ideological sort of definition of the people and outgroups, along with personalist governance, right, breaking down formal institutions and governing via personal prerogative, are pretty well documented in the political science scholarship related to populism. And in the book, what I try to argue is that both of these kind of contributed to changes that I saw in the foreign policy process. I'm actually not going to talk as much about the in-group, out-group side, just because we don't have too much time. But religion was involved in this for sure. So here President Trump is holding up the executive orders related to the so-called Muslim bans in his first weeks in office. I would argue that these Muslim bans related both to visa access and the refugee resettlement program were deeply tied to this populist exclusion of certain threats to the people, right, which were partially framed in religious terms. There were also elements of religion that defined the in-group, right? Maybe this is where Christian nationalism comes in that we could talk a little bit more about. So that went on for sure. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But in the interest of time, I actually thought I would spend most of my time talking about the other half of the story. This effect of personalist governance, of the way that populists govern on the bureaucracy. Because in some ways, I think this was what was most different about the first Trump administration and very much leads into what we've seen in the last month or so. So I said that populists govern by rejecting institutional constraint, right, and sort of exercising personalist power, right, based on their claims to authority. How does this work out in practice? Okay, so if you're working in a State Department office and all of a sudden a populist comes into power, right, what happens? Well, one of the things that I try to look at in the book is actually how a few different things can happen, right? What happened to the office that I was working in, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, was neglect for the most part, actually, right? This is, I think it's probably visible, this is the 7th floor of the State Department. The Secretary of State's office is about 200 yards behind me here, right? This is not buried in some outbuilding. This is the 7th floor of the State Department, and those are office dividers, just randomly showing up in the hallway, right? As offices were kind of neglected and people were rotated into other positions, the staffing levels of offices, including ours, were diminished. But nobody came to shut us down in particular. We were just ignored, right? Because we were irrelevant, right, to the populist governance strategy. The orb picture, right, the picture of Trump with his hand on the orb that I showed you at the start, there was a major address on Islam and politics that Trump gave along with that. Our office should have been at the center of giving feedback on that kind of a speech. We didn't even receive it until about like 12 hours before it was to be given. And it wasn't from a political appointee, it was from a career official who said, holy cow, has RGA seen this? And do you guys have any thoughts? It wasn't intentional. We were just seen as irrelevant, right? And populists are more than happy to, so long as the bureaucracy isn't causing them problems, to simply bypass the bureaucracy, right? To ignore it. And that was a fair amount of what we saw. You know, there's a really telling quote, I think, from one of Trump's early evangelical supporters, a guy by the name of Johnny Moore, who said, quote, "One of the problems with the US government and with governments around the world that are flush with cash is that we end up with lots and lots of offices. Lots and lots of offices. But why do we even need them, right?" So that's what we experienced. And I talk a fair amount in the book about how that played out in practice. Actually, at that point in time, people didn't lose their jobs. They simply rotated out to their next positions and weren't backfilled, right? At its peak, my office, RGA, had about 30 people as its staff. When I left in August of 2017, along with 2 other colleagues, just because of the normal schedule, there were 5 individuals left as full-time employees in that office. No one got fired, right? It was just people rotating on to their next jobs, not being replaced, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But there was sometimes a sharper edge to it. And we've seen more of this recently, which is why we want to be sure to put this on the agenda. There were times when this kind of personalist prerogative led to confrontation with the bureaucracy, right? And the way that this probably showed itself most vividly the first time around was through the Trump administration's relationship with USAID, which has come home to roost in the last month or so, I would say. This is from the first term. The Trump administration had a desire to channel redevelopment funding in post-ISIS areas directly to churches rather than through multinational organizations and other development groups, right? As these proposals were put forward, career bureaucrats at USAID reviewed them and found them to not meet the standards that they had for funding proposals, right, for various reasons, and rejected these proposals, right? This was then, this got back to the White House, right, and to the Vice President's office, who was quite close to religious conservatives around the administration, and individuals within USAID were reassigned out of the office that was responsible for reviewing these proposals, right? And in their place, political appointees were put in place who would approve those proposals moving forward, right? The money did get through at the end of the day, and people did find themselves, you know, career people found themselves shunted into other corners of the agency. And again, this quote from an administration official kind of puts this in context. Quote, "The political appointees are much more willing to help us, but they have been unable to move the bureaucracy." Right? That's in reference to this USAID situation. When that happens, there was confrontation. And I think we've seen more of that in the last month, as I'll talk about. Okay, so what replaced this? Well, again, this strong preference, as came out in the Huckabee Sanders quote that I opened us up with, for personal ties rather than bureaucratic expertise, right? So, for instance, this is a picture from the early days of the administration of the president being prayed over in the White House by members of his campaign's evangelical advisory board and other kind of religious supporters of the administration. This is the kind of thing that was really talked about as being meaningful, right? Not, well, I don't know if it was just a show or not, right? But this seemed to be really important. This mattered, the personal presence, right? That quote, meetings in an article about whether the bureaucracy was being undermined, one of the president's supporters said, no, what matters, quote, is that meetings at the White House and State Department are beginning and ending with prayer, right? And that was more important than bureaucratized expertise related to religion and advising, right? It mattered where the heart of the administration was, right? That phrase that Sanders uses, Huckabee Sanders uses, that I think is really capturing something very important, actually. And we experienced this, right, in the bureaucracy. And actually, there's role for prayer in public meetings. This is not necessarily a violation of the Constitution or anything like that, right? But the idea that personal access, right, directly to senior administration officials is how the administration's religious bona fides should be judged, right? I think it's very indicative of a populist style of governance rather than expertise through bureaucracy that's built up over time. So the book goes into this in a little more detail, but this coexistence of neglect with occasional confrontation, with a preference for personal ties, persisted throughout the first Trump administration's term in office. I think that there was more neglect and there's been more confrontation recently, and we can talk more about that in Q&A. But I think that this is something that we wouldn't expect just any conservative to do. That's what I try to argue. Right? This isn't just about the left-right divide in American politics, right? To put it more concretely, George W. Bush puts in place the PEPFAR program, in my opinion, easily his greatest achievement as president, right? PEPFAR is a multi-dimensional, big-dollar, big technical expertise program related to AIDS prevention primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, globally, but primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, right? This is a heavily institutionalized program. It relies on expertise to deliver social services in partnership with religious networks frequently, right? It's not anti-institutional at all. It's heavily institutionalized, right? There may be some differences between Democratic and Republican administrations in how you carry that out, but the basic approach was to build that bureaucratic capacity, build that expertise. And that's not what we see here, right? We see a very different approach. Okay, so what I do in the second half of the book then is try to analyze, well, how did we get ourselves into this situation? Were there some guardrails that could have stabilized the situation? And how did they operate? And I wind up arguing in ways that I think are probably turning out to be more right maybe than I was even hoping, that there were several preconditions in religion and American politics that made religion and politics especially vulnerable to this kind of populist manipulation that pre-existed the Trump administration and did not go away, right? So what do I mean by that? First, I look at the deep state. I've got a chapter on will the deep state save us, right? I have a tremendous amount of admiration for my career State Department colleagues. I also should be clear, I don't speak for them in the book, I just speak for my own experience. But in my experience, State Department colleagues were frequently dissatisfied with decisions that were made by the populist administration. They really didn't like the process breaking down, right? They really didn't like breakdowns in the sort of standard bureaucratic processes. But how did they respond? They didn't respond with deep state resistance in my lived experience. What they responded with was approved bureaucratic dissent, right? So probably most famously, in the days after the Muslim ban is drafted, before it's officially issued, there's a so-called dissent channel cable that's signed by over 1,000 State Department employees. This is unprecedented. The dissent channel is a way for diplomats to register their disagreement with a policy. It's usually signed by like a dozen people. Right? This is signed by over 1,000 individuals within the State Department. It details why the Muslim bans are both rationally counterproductive and run counter to American values. It's a powerful document, I think. This is what deep state resistance looked like, and I don't think the Trump administration could have cared less, right? This isn't actually undermining of the policy process. This is working through the official policy process because that's the bureaucratic culture very powerfully, I think. In ways that we should appreciate, actually, right? But I do think that it means that the idea that a deep state would sort of save us from things we don't like about populist governance is naive, to be perfectly honest, because of pretty deeply entrenched cultural norms within the bureaucracy. Sean Spicer actually used this dissent channel cable as a chance to go on national TV and bash the bureaucracy, right? And say, well, if they don't like, this is not a quote, but if they don't like the policy, they need to either get with the program or get out, right? Because he was very comfortable in populist terms kind of playing that card. So I don't think that the deep state will save us, honestly. Maybe the courts will. How about the courts? Well, the Muslim bans were litigated, right? There were several early stage victories actually won. Very strongly worded district and appellate court opinions that went against the administration. What the administration did was slowly but surely update the Muslim ban executive orders over time, removing some of the most offensive content. And by the time eventually the cases are all consolidated at the Supreme Court in Trump versus Hawaii, ultimately, what happens? The Muslim bans are upheld. Right? The Muslim bans are upheld for a few reasons. First of all, because of the extreme deference to the executive branch when it comes to foreign policy and migration. Right? Chief Justice Roberts writes the opinion in Trump versus Hawaii, and he says in that opinion, quote, that the Immigration and Naturalization Act, quote, exudes deference to the president in every clause. Right? This is Chief Justice Roberts, who's seen as one of the institutionalists, right, on the court, saying that we need to have exuding deference to the executive branch. The executive branch is dominant, right, and the courts essentially concede to that. The majority also has no time for the First Amendment argument about this being a violation of the religion clauses in the First Amendment, right? They totally dismiss that. There's a dissent, really nice dissent, that you can take a look at, but it doesn't win the argument. So the courts have such flexibility when it comes to interpreting, especially the religion clauses of the Constitution, that I just don't see there being a rigid enough constraint to really stabilize things. The last, then, potential source of constraint switches to public opinion. And here I'm going to show you a little bit of quantitative data. Not too much, I promise. But hey, we can be political science majors and religious studies majors, right? I know we have some philosophy and religion majors probably in the room. We might have some political science or School of International Service majors. You can do both, right? I did both. Do both. If you're SIS and you're thinking about philosophy and religious studies, come on over and do both at the same time, right? Okay, so anyway, a little bit of data. Maybe public opinion will save us. I think that honestly our public opinion related to religion and politics is so polarized that at this point in time it's very hard for me to imagine that to be the case. Let me explain what's going on in this graph. So this is a graph that is showing the effect on public opinion of showing people an article that reported Christian pastors defending Trump from the classified documents investigation. You remember that? Yeah, that was fun, right? So what we did was we randomly divided people in half, and half of the people in the survey read a newspaper article about Christian pastors defending the Trump administration and saying that the classified documents investigation was, fake news and political persecution and that sort of stuff, right? And what we're interested in is, would this kind of religious endorsement, right, for blessing America first, for kind of supporting populist politics, would this undermine the moral authority of religious leaders? Because we might think that, hey, maybe religious leaders will actually act as a brake on this. Maybe they won't be comfortable going along with this if they know that in their own congregations or their own populations, they might face some costs for this, actually, right? That people aren't comfortable with this. Maybe there'll be some cost to what political scientists call the moral authority of these religious leaders. Okay, so what does this data show? Essentially, it shows that it's all down to partisanship. And so it's true, if you're a religious leader whose congregation has a lot of non-Trump voters in it, they don't like this stuff, right? When non-Trump voters read this article, and then we asked them about how much trust they had in religious leaders and about their moral authority, they said they were less trusting in religious leaders. They decreased the moral authority of religious leaders. So you might go, oh, okay, well, maybe public opinion could put the brakes on here. But this is the one that you need to pay attention to also. For Trump voters, they actually increased the moral authority of religious leaders after reading about this defense. And those effects are statistically significant and in totally opposite directions for those who are kind of at the more quantitative end of the spectrum, right? So in other words, our popular responses to religious endorsement of Trumpism are totally conditioned by our politics, not by our religion, right? And if that's the case, there are actually reasons why religious leaders who think that their people are generally open to the Trump message to actually proactively continue with this kind of endorsement, right? Their moral authority is increasing when they engage in this kind of political speech. So this kind of polarization in public opinion has been noted in other sources. This was the first time that we looked at it in particular related to elements of the foreign policy bureaucracy. And it confirms to me that our public opinion related to religion and politics in this country is so polarized that it's hard for me to imagine that it would put the brakes on this kind of thing moving forward. So the book doesn't end on a total down note. I try to kind of think about what might this look like in the future, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But all of these preconditions pre-existed the Trump administration, right? And they haven't gone away in the 4 years since the first Trump administration. And so, in a way, I'm not surprised that we are back where we are, Now, there are some things that I'll observe on a preliminary basis about the last month and how I'm thinking about how that relates to the argument that we've seen so far. Let's see, where are we on time? No, we're okay. All right. So I think that I'll talk about two things in this section. The first is how we think about Christian nationalism's role in this story. This might be a concept that's on some of your mind. I know some of you have been reading about this concept from Whitehead and Perry and others in classes. I think that one of the things that has gotten my attention as a scholar in the last several years and even now today in the first few weeks of the new administration is the extent to which we need Christian nationalism, but we also need additional factors, right, to explain what's going on with Christian nationalism. What do I mean by that? Well, let's think back to the time around January 6th, right? It's not breaking news that religious symbols and networks were present around that time. So this is an event called the Jericho March, tied to Trump's religious supporters, that actually happened before January 6th, right? This was in the days leading up to January 6th. And so there was obvious religious imagery and symbolism around the January 6th events, right? So some people have seen that and said, that's Christian nationalism at work. And I think there's some truth to that. But there was also some different kind of stuff that isn't Christian nationalism. Some of you may know who this is. Anybody know who this is? Noted religious leader Alex Jones. Oh, no, wait. Noted conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, right? What's he do? And this is at the Jericho March. He's not a Christian nationalist. Well, maybe he is in his personal beliefs, but he's not a religious leader. So what's going on here, right? To me, as a scholar, what we've started to build more evidence of in the last few years is that Christian nationalism is part of the story, but we also need to be incorporating attention to some of these newer dynamics in Christianity and politics, including the presence of disinformation and conspiratorial viewpoints within Christian networks, right? And that, in my view, it's particularly in those contexts when Christian nationalism has been shown to be dangerous to the democratic process, right? Again, I'll show a little bit of survey data here from a project that's a paper that's outside of the book related to support for the January 6th riots. So these are what are called marginal effects, basically showing how much of an effect does Christian nationalism have on support for the riots, right, or the violence at January 6th, right? So overall, what these graphs are showing is that actually at low values of Christian nationalism, right? So here, here, and here, or sorry, at low values of conspiratorial beliefs, sorry. Over here, over here. If you don't have strong conspiratorial beliefs, Christian nationalism is actually not having much of an effect on support for the violence, right? If you don't have strong perceived victimhood, Christian nationalism is not having much of an effect. That's a zero effect, right? If you don't have strong white identity, it's having a little bit of an effect, but it's not distinguishable from zero. But once you get to the point where you have strong conspiratorial beliefs or strong perceived victimhood, then the effect of Christian nationalism really starts to pop. So in other words, it's not enough to just have Christian nationalist beliefs. You need to be a Christian nationalist who also has conspiratorial beliefs. That's when we seem to see these things getting activated politically, right? So I think that moving forward, there's a need to continue to pay attention to this, and I think that we've certainly seen this continue as a trend in the last 6 weeks or so. What else have I noticed in the past 6 weeks? Well, I think that the defining feature of the first month of the Trump administration has to be that this anti-institutionalism, this personalist governance, has just gotten turned up to 11 in ways that I could not have anticipated, and I think are important for us to be aware of as being really unprecedented in modern history, right? The extent to which the foreign policy bureaucracy, in particular USAID, has been targeted, right, for effectively elimination, right, is new to say the least, right, and really morally and pragmatically troubling. But it's also tied up with religion in interesting ways, right? For instance, there's been some reporting about the fact that the largest single grantee for USAID is Catholic Relief Services, right? We've heard a lot about how, for instance, the Catholic conversion of our vice president contributes to his politics, right? Well, Catholic Relief Services is facing a 50% staffing cut if it loses the federal contracts that are tied to this, right? So you might say, huh, that's kind of interesting. Well, maybe this will be the kind of thing that puts a check, again, on this anti-institutional behavior, right? Because there's kind of a religious ideology behind the administration, and so they'll need to kind of take care of religious charities. Maybe. I know that some of these things are still ongoing, and there's still meetings about how these cuts are going to play out. But it's been noteworthy to me that there have actually been religious endorsers of these kinds of cuts. This is probably the most famous face of that, Franklin Graham, Reverend Billy Graham's son, right, who was one of Trump's earlier religious supporters. And he has gone on the record publicly as being in support of re-examining how we use our development spending and thinking that it's a good idea to take a hard look at this kind of stuff. Right? So religious loyalists actually coming to the defense of the anti-institutional behavior, even when it cuts against certain religious charities. Right? Not only that, but we've seen some early evidence that religious influences, including international religious influences, might have a role in determining what kinds of programs are saved moving forward. This is a piece of reporting that is from a Hungarian news outlet, sympathetic to the government in Hungary, which is sort of closely tied to Christian nationalism and populist politics there, reporting that a Hungarian official responsible for religious freedom promotion has been invited to be a part of the State Department process of reviewing which grants to preserve and which to not preserve. Again, this is super interesting because it suggests to me that eventually some capacity is going to be rebuilt, actually. But who will be the voices that are influencing that rebuilding process, right? The personal loyalists, right, to the administration, both in the US, but also even internationally. So we've seen this anti-institutional behavior, and religion has not checked it. It's actually contributed to it, right, in, I think, interesting ways. Okay, I'm going to skip the religious freedom point for now. I'm happy to talk about it, international religious freedom. But in the interest of time and not wanting to be totally pessimistic, I also wanted to take a few minutes to step back and think about what role might there be for religion in strengthening democracy in tough times. In this section, I'm going to step back actually a little bit from the book and foreign policy and talk a little bit more broadly about some of the things that we know about religion and democracy and some of the trends that we've seen play out in other cases as well, including the Philippines, where I've done a lot of work over the years. So, what role might religion play in stabilizing democracy during populist politics? Maybe religious authority can play a part in challenging populist division and rebuilding trust. Right? Populism as a movement, again, is built on the personal authority of the populist, and institutional distrust is a big part of that. Right? Could religion play some part in trying to rebuild some of that trust and maybe even reform institutions that need reform? Well, we ran co-authors and I ran one of these survey experiments to try to get at this in the US context. We did this a couple of years ago, looking at questions of police reform. Right? As I think a lot of you are probably aware, questions of police reform are still incredibly pressing in the US and very tied to populist politics for sure. And what we were curious of is whether religious leaders might, by being involved in reform efforts, have the ability to build support for those efforts, right, in ways that go beyond normal kind of activists for social justice, basically. So we ran an experiment. We described a police accountability initiative that had the involvement of your standard community organizations, business leaders, civic leaders. And then for the other half of the group, we ran the same description, but we included religious leaders in the group who would be involved in that police reform effort. And then we asked people how supportive they would be. What did we find? Well, one thing that we found was that Republicans, and this is going to be a little bit hard to track here, but Republicans in the religious treatment are on the right, and that little dash there, that's the average value, right? And then on the left, this is the folks who didn't hear about religion, right? You can see that in the religious treatment, Republican support for police reform efforts actually was higher, right? So maybe there is some ability for religious leaders to kind of break through polarization over reform efforts. It's possible. Religious leaders have played this part at times in American history. and maybe they could going forward. We've seen some religious leaders start to issue messages related, for instance, to the USAID funding freeze, right? That have tried to challenge the idea that USAID is a den of conspiracy and sin and all the other allegations that are being made against it, and instead say, in the words of Cardinal Supich from Chicago, that USAID is sort of doing morally important work and that there would be sort of morally problematic consequences if it was cut. Could this break through partisan divisions? I'll be honest that I'm not entirely sure. In this experiment, actually, on the right, Democrats didn't much like having religious leaders involved in that reform effort, right? So that's maybe a complicated piece of it. But if there's at least a little bit of evidence that religious leaders might be able to use their moral authority to build confidence in reform efforts and accountability efforts. And so maybe that would be a path going forward. For the last two examples, as I wrap up, I'm going to talk about a different location. I'm going to talk about the Philippines for just a minute. Now, I don't have time to give a detailed overview of religion in Philippine politics, but as some of you might be aware, former President Rodrigo Duterte was a law and order populist, right? As I mentioned at the beginning, imprisoning the political opposition, but most famously, overseeing a drug war in which thousands or even tens of thousands of mostly poor drug users and low-level dealers were killed either in extrajudicial killings or in police operations that have been disputed. Right? Well, one of the things that took place during this period of populist violence was mobilization of local religious networks to try to blunt the implementation of populist policy. Right? What do I mean by that? Oh, sorry, I should have put that up. Populist policy needs to be implemented at the grassroots. Right? The populist can say whatever he or she wants at the national level, but ultimately governance requires grassroots implementation, and that grassroots implementation might open avenues for community protection. So for instance, the violence of the drug war in Manila, this is geolocated data or spatially aggregated data related to the intensity of killings. It's a little bit hard to see, but it was uneven across Metro Manila, right? And what we find in this research project is effectively that people weren't being killed around Catholic churches in the same way that they were in other areas, even once you hold all sorts of other things constant quantitatively, right? We ask why. We have a survey of Philippine police officers where it turns out that Philippine police officers are really sensitive to religious criticisms of their work. So we subjected these police officers to criticisms in human rights terms of policing practices during the drug war. On the left, we had those criticisms come from an unidentified group. On the right, we had those criticisms come from a religious leader. And then we asked the officers how concerned they would be that this kind of critics' pressure could cause consequences for police. As you can see, the level of concern was significantly higher when it was religious groups who were issuing that kind of criticism. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that in the Philippine context, grassroots state agents, grassroots police officers, who ultimately have to implement policy, were more sensitive to concerns from religious leaders than from other secular human rights organizations. Okay? Well, what might this mean more broadly? Well, maybe it means that as populist policy is implemented, it's difficult to change it at the national level, difficult to challenge it at the national level. Duterte leaves office in the Philippines quite popular, right? However, it might be able to be stabilized and mitigated to an extent in local communities. What could that look like in the US? Well, I don't know, but what about local immigration implementation? What about the capacity that religious institutions frequently have in local communities, tied to pre-existing work that they've done with migrant populations over decades, right? That not only gives them relationships in those at-risk communities, but also gives them relationships with local law enforcement, with local civil society organizations, with local lawyers and local judges. Can they leverage that kind of pre-existing relational capacity at the grassroots level to protect local communities and maybe stabilize democracy in the long run? I think this is possible, right? I've heard anecdotally already from a couple of folks with contacts near the border that quietly grassroots religious networks are trying to do this work already. I want to be very clear that in the Philippine context, this did not stop the violence, right? But there is evidence that it reduced the violence and maybe helped to not just advance human rights, but even sort of stabilize the country in the long term. So there are some other aspects of religion's potential role in democracy preservation that I think could be worth noting. I think, for instance, the need to preserve institutional records, right, and institutional memory during these periods is really important. we have tens of thousands of federal contracts that are being canceled, right, as in the last 24 hours. And those contracts represent some worthy programs, some that probably could be cut without any great damage to humanity, right? Who's going to keep a record of that expertise, right? A lot of those proposals are coming from religious charities. Actually, a majority probably of those proposals are coming from religious charities. That kind of institutional knowledge, keeping a documentary history of our government capacity, could be really important in this period to eventually, hopefully, restoring some institutional capacity in the future. But with that said, I don't think that the near future, to say nothing of the long term, is likely to remove some of these forces from the American political scene. I think that these are challenges that we'll face. If anything, some of the research, especially coming out of the Philippine context, to me, tells me that the future of religion and democracy and religion's potential role in stabilizing democracy is actually not likely to look like what it did maybe 30 or 40 years ago. I don't know if anyone knows, this is Cory Aquino on the left, the sort of face of people power revolution in the Philippines in 1986. She's pictured here with Cardinal Sin, right, the immaculately named Cardinal Sin, from the Catholic Church, a country majority Catholic. And Cardinal Sin's leadership was very important to that country's peaceful revolution in 1986. I don't see this happening again, right? I think the future of religion and stabilizing democracy is a lot more likely to look like this image, actually. This is a nun in a urban poor community in Manila who's working out of a mission station. It's a small, not even official parish, right? Little mission station in one of these urban poor communities. But the work in these mission stations, because they're located in the communities at risk, right, of the violence that was being implemented by the populist regime, allowed those local contacts to engage in some protective activities, to engage in some activities documenting the truth of what was going on in these communities, and maybe eventually some accountability work even, right, as time passes. But that's a longer story. I think that recent research on the political science side of things anyway does suggest that an alternative future without these religious interventions would render democracy and the local communities that we hope it serves even more vulnerable. So thanks for being here, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buckley, for a number of really interesting insights. Many questions emerge in my head, and I'm imagining in yours. What I'd like to do is capture these questions, though, on microphone. So I'll try to run, or I have a colleague as well. Thank you, Eugene. We'll try to run and get you a microphone if you have a question, but please, by show of hands, and we'll pass around the microphones when you get one, ask your question. Thank you so much.
Hi, great job.
Thank you.
So my question is, in hearing you discuss, right, this highly, defined in-group of, these very conservative, highly MAGA, Protestant and Catholic groups in the United States, right? Do you consider this group kind of distinct from global Christianity and almost an American interpretation and American, origin story of this stuff? That holds Trump up as a figure, right, a spiritual figure? And if so, right, would that provide an extra shield to religious figures outside of that in-group, their criticism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm a comparative political scientist, right? I study different settings, and to me, actually, this phenomenon of kind of religious nationalist populism is cropping up in too many places to think that this is just an American thing, right? We're seeing this going on in Brazil. We're seeing this going on in Turkey. We're seeing this going on in India. We're seeing even Buddhist nationalism have a moment in Sri Lanka, although that's kind of stepped back now. So I don't think that this is a uniquely American force. I think this combination of kind of religion and nationalism as defining the in-group, right, and then kind of contributing also to the threats that we see outside it, is something that we've just seen in too many places right now to think that it's just an American story. I do think that there are kind of uniquely American elements to it, right? So you could make a case to me that the kind of style, for instance, of certain forms of American Christianity kind of overlaps with Trump's kind of populist style, right? This kind of performative, kind of rally-based kind of approach to religious mobilization and also political mobilization. I think there are American components to it, don't get me wrong. But there's too much international affinity for me to think that that's all that's going on, right? And they're learning from each other. Right? I mean, there are interesting, and the book has a chapter on international exchanges among religious populists, right? Bolsonaro in Brazil, for instance, has several of the same advisors who have been around the Trump administration when it comes to religion and politics. And even beyond the Christian world, in India, there's been a lot of mutual admiration between the Hindu nationalist movement and elements of the kind of Christian nationalist movement, right? Who don't share, you wouldn't think, a whole lot religiously, right? Except maybe skepticism of Muslims. But it's empirically true. But who have, because they share a kind of religious nationalist worldview, like have had mutual admiration for each other. So, yeah, I would think of it on a more global stage, honestly.
Sorry, thank you. First off, thank you for coming and presenting for us today. My question is kind of rooted in your last remarks about how you kind of see religion playing into what possibly could be further aid in the future and how religion really combats this. Should we be concerned for new religious missionary work and aid turning into something of a new colonialism practice? We're seeing right now, in particular with Trump and his plans by Gaza, wanting to take it over as a kind of his own land. And there's been kind of underlying religious tones, but not yet. Should we be concerned with this and other examples in the future moving forward?
Yeah, so it's been very startling the extent to which Trump has adopted this kind of neo-colonial framing very openly, right, in the first few weeks, right? Not just Gaza, but the Panama Canal, renaming Denali, right? I mean, Gulf of wherever, the whole thing, right? Very openly kind of playing this neo-colonial game, right? Making no bones about it. And religion, as I think many of you in this room know from your classes, was deeply kind of tied to America's project of colonialism, including in the Philippines, by the way, right? A country that we said we were going to Christianize when we colonized it after the Spanish-American War, right? Even though it was Catholic and indigenous and Muslim, actually. So that I think that thread has been there in American colonial history, and I do think that there's every reason to expect that. I haven't tracked this yet, but there's every reason to expect, I think, that Trump's sort of religious supporters, right, that some of these religious leaders who have been supportive of him would frame their support for things like taking back the Panama Canal in similar terms. That would be really interesting to track. I haven't actually tracked that yet, but it would be worth looking at because there's obviously a history there. Right?
Thank you. So I wanted to ask about the current situation with the Pope in terms of his health and what happens. Like we talk about Catholic charities related to USAID or other Christian charities. The Pope has been fairly outspoken about, his whole kind of tendency, he's been fairly liberal, so to speak, but he's been very outspoken about like what's going on in Gaza and, the dismantling of USAID. But I guess then what is the risk that the next Pope, presumably being fairly imminent as being, or do we think it's going to be more conservative in order to kind of try to not make waves with the administration? Or, is it possible that we're going to lose that area of pushback?
Yeah, so I guess I would say two things. First, on the papacy of Francis, it is again, it's been an amazing couple of weeks, right? It's not every day in American history that the sitting Pope instructs the vice president on the tenets of his faith, right? That's pretty new. For those who don't know, use the Google; it'll tell you. So Francis has positioned himself, right, in opposition, fraternal correction, right, of even Catholic leaders who are tied to right-wing populism, not just in the United States, but also in Western Europe, right, tied to refugee resettlement especially. He's been very comfortable in that posture, and I think that is very important on an international standard level. I do think that it's essential, though, that those international messages filter down to local religious leaders, right? And I think Francis probably knows this. There was a famous instance, actually, in which then candidate Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines called Pope Francis a son of a whore, right? Said it in local language. But you might be like, wait a minute, what? How did this man wants to become president of the Philippines and he called the Pope a son of a whore? How could this be, right? Well, what Duterte understood was, what he actually said was, the reason I'm late for this rally is because of the Pope's visit and there's so much traffic. The Pope, that son of a whore, right? He was complaining about the traffic. And he was complaining about how elites in the country muck everything up for average people like you and me. And I think his audience understood that, actually, right? Not as an attack on their religion, but as an attack on elites who are kind of out of touch, right? And I say this, therefore, to say that I think it's even more important that these kind of international messages trickle down into congregations, right? Religion is a little bit like Congress. Nobody likes Congress. Most people like their congressperson, right? A lot of people don't trust religious leaders, but most people actually like their religious leader, right? And I think that that is really important and something that is not going on within the American Catholic Church, right? Francis wrote that letter, in my opinion, and this has been reported by some others too, not to correct Vance, but to tell the U.S. bishops that this was what they were supposed to be saying, because then it trickles down. But that's a challenging process, right? On what comes next, I don't personally know. It's hard to speculate. I do think it's good for Americans to realize that, like, the Vatican doesn't always think about the United States, right? So it won't just be about Trump. Now, is there, though, this phenomenon of right-wing or kind of religious nationalism around the world is going on, and would there be a desire to have someone who can at least talk to nationalist leaders in Western Europe also and not alienate them, more diplomatic? It's possible. I find it hard to believe that you would get one of the more explicitly kind of like sympathetic cardinals to kind of more conservative nationalism elected. I suspect that would be seen as too much of a rebuke to Francis. And he's also appointed the vast majority of the cardinals at this point in time. But I could see a more diplomatic kind of presence coming through. But, you know, it's hard to predict. I don't know. Watch Conclave. You can make
Thank you. So I was really fascinated. Sorry, I'm
Yep.
I'm a bit short. I was really fascinated by your discussion of the preconditions that you noted in the U.S. being like the bureaucratic culture and whatnot. And so with that in mind, I was wondering if you had any speculations on why this is happening now, because it can't just be because of like Trump and his personality, because as you said, it's popping up elsewhere. And so I was just wondering if you knew or you speculated why there's so much of this, you know, Christian or religious nationalism going on.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the timing of these things, right? Again, not because it's not just in the United States. It's going on in so many settings, right? I mean, I could say scholars tend to approach it from sort of two different perspectives, right? On the one hand, some scholars emphasize more economic dissatisfaction with the performance of post-industrial capitalism, right? And so stagnating wages, frustration with the ruling party elites from the sort of predominant center-left and center-right parties in both Europe and the United States, as being unable to deliver the economic progress that non-elite communities want to see, right? So there's an economic side, I think, to the analysis of populism's rise that has some evidence behind it. There's also a kind of cultural side to the argument that tends to emphasize new religious pluralism, right? This is especially the case, I think, in Western Europe, where there's, in some countries, right, the rise of national or sort of right-wing populist nationalists is tied to the Syrian refugee crisis and the expansion of that particular refugee community in Germany especially, but in European politics more generally. And so that's more of a cultural explanation. These things are going on at the same time, right? So it's hard to pull them apart. I think that the other thing that's hard to put, and this was where religion maybe comes back into the story too, in a different way. It's hard to put your finger on, but there's some interesting work related to declining rates of institutional trust internationally. And that includes trust in organized religion, but it also includes trust in mainstream political parties and satisfaction with their performance, and trust in the media, right? And this is not, again, just the United States. This is going on globally. And where does that declining trust come from? Well, that could be tied up with economics. It could be tied up with culture. It could also be tied up with technology, right? In the way that modern information technology allows us to silo ourselves. So it's hard to entangle, but I tend to think that it's some intersection of those factors that help to explain the timing. Because you're right, none of these preconditions is new. And so if there's been change, the question is, why are they showing themselves in this way now, right? It's a great question.
Hello. So the new Trump administration recently established the Faith Office, and I was wondering how that's different from the former, faith sort of advisory committees that the White House had before. And will this have a more active role within the White House?
Right. So the short answer is that office I don't think is where the new action is. So that office essentially replicates an office. It's called something different under each administration, but presidents going back to, I believe for the first time, to the Clinton administration's charitable choice period, and then the George W. Bush administration's faith-based initiative, set up White House offices that were tasked with kind of coordinating engagement with religious groups across the executive agencies, right? And then you could have that office within the executive agencies also, right? They've called these different things, but in general, administrations have had these kinds of things. It's interesting, actually, the first Trump administration took 2 years to get around to that office. Why? Because, again, they didn't think it was important. The people who were going to be doing it were already there for the prayer meetings, right? It winds up being Paula White, who's in charge of it now, also who was in charge of it then. So I think that's more continuity. To me, the newer thing that's worth tracking is the task force on anti-Christian discrimination that's been established by executive order, in the executive order on combating anti-Christian bias, I think. I would have to remind myself of the exact title. Yes, the combating anti-Christian bias executive order. That executive order establishes this task force that's headquartered or coordinated through the Justice Department and involves leadership from every executive agency. But what's new about it is that the task force's job is to root out anti-Christian bias from within the bureaucracy, right? So this is effectively supposed to be monitoring the executive agencies like the Department of Education, Veterans Affairs, whatever, for potential anti-Christian bias within the government. And then, in theory, using that as a reason to justify changing that institution in some way. So using a faith-based office for community outreach or outreach to religious kind of partners, that's not new. Convening a task force to potentially sort of criticize or further kind of reform your own executive departments, that's new. And I think that fits with this kind of anti-institutional pattern that we've seen in the last 6 weeks. Yeah, so that's what I would be keeping my eyes on, and I think it's interesting to watch.
So my question was primarily about Latin America, and
Okay.
we've seen a lot of evangelical churches become very strongly tied to populists, both on the left and the right, such as like Maduro and also Bolsonaro. So I was kind of wondering, do you think this is at all like a connected phenomenon to how American evangelicals are very close to Trump? Is it just like an independent evolution, or
So does evangelicalism as kind of a religious form fit with populist politics?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and you probably know the region way better than I do. You're right, in a number of comparative settings there, from what I know. It's also, Latin America is a great reminder that populism is not a left-right thing, right? It's a different axis. It's not about left-right. You can have left-wing populism and right-wing populism. And evangelicals have been involved in both in Latin America, yeah. So the argument would go something, I think, like evangelicalism is a less bureaucratized approach to religious organization, right? It's a more kind of bottom-up approach to religious organization, more horizontally organized. Authority tends to come from personal charisma rather than from institutional endorsement. It tends to, especially in Latin America, be very present in socioeconomically marginalized communities, right? Which fits in with populist bases of mobilization also. And so, yeah, maybe there is kind of an elected affinity there. The only caution that I would add is that there are sort of Catholic actors who have been on board with populist politics, right, in Latin America and in the U.S. and in Western Europe. You know, and we actually were talking about this afternoon, though, because there are some interesting tensions there, right, in terms of one that, like, does someone, yeah, do the Catholics who are involved in supporting kind of religious populist politics behave the same way that the evangelical supporters of those movements do? It would be interesting to do that kind of research. I think they probably don't in some interesting ways. So I think there's also scholarship on the style of populism, right? Populists tend to have this kind of performative style, big rallies, modern technology, use information technology, social media very effectively for their growth. And populists also tend to do all of these things, right? I think that's pretty convincing work, actually. I think it's kind of interesting. I always hesitate to say that, like, a religion is essentially one thing politically, because there's always going to be internal diversity, right? And in this country, we have evangelicals who have taken kind of anti-populist stands, right? But is there an overall affinity? Well, it seems to be cropping up in a lot of settings, yeah.
Hi. Do Americans care, or especially the American right or the Christian right, do they care what kind of Christian Donald Trump or J.D. Vance are, and why not?
I think you actually asked an easier version of the question. I don't think they care what kind of Christian they are. Do they care that they're a Christian? Might be a more complicated question or a trickier question. We don't know, right? The counterfactual doesn't exist. There have certainly been, like, very religiously orthodox Jews around in Trump's orbit, right? So we know that there's an element of, and he receives a lot more popular support from Orthodox Jews than from other members of the American Jewish community. So we do know that there's a Jewish element or an element of American Judaism that finds Trumpism kind of appealing. But if he himself was a Jew, right, like, would his appeal be dented? I don't know. I haven't seen much evidence on that. But I don't think that the particulars of their theological beliefs really matter much, right? I mean, we saw this in the 2016 campaign when there were questions about would Trump be able to appeal to white evangelicals, right? And one white evangelical leader referred to him as a baby Christian, right? Isn't it like a little baby Christian? You know, he can tell a religious story about his background a bit, but it's not his comfort zone. You can tell when he tells a story it's not what he wants to be talking about. And I don't think that his particular beliefs about religion are why religious supporters support him.
We have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll call it for the evening, but I think we'll stick around for a few minutes as you all grab a little bit more food and maybe have a chance to meet Dr. Buckley one-on-one. But I think this will be our last question for the sake of time. Oh, sorry, 2 questions. My apologies. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. First off, thank you so much for an excellent presentation and taking your time to be here. I had kind of a question about what you talked about in the beginning with the populist takeover and the characteristics of it, especially combined with, like, Christian nationalism and the kind of, like, conspiratorial characteristics we see. Is there any, like, worry that these, like, populist characteristics combined with, like, Christian nationalism will devolve into a more, like, fascist form of governance? And if so, like, is there anything that, like, kind of grassroots organizations can do to mitigate, like, the violence that would cause?
Yeah, I have to admit that as a comparative political scientist, the fascism word, I think, gets tossed around a little more than is warranted in American politics right now. Fascism was a, like, particular approach to the economy and politics, and also mobilization, a kind of public display of loyalty. That is on the edges here, right? I can see why, and some of the economic kind of capture of of the tech industry, for instance, right? And like the mobilization of that. Like I can see why there's some analogies being drawn there. I don't quite think that we're at that level yet of ideological cohesion, right? To me, one of the things that is important to remember is that populists are very flexible ideologically, right? They'll kind of sound like leftists when it comes to unionization, right? Trump has made some of these noises, and then they'll sound extremely culturally conservative, and then they'll sound like they're anti-immigrant. And then they'll kind of go into the conspiratorial world. They're flexible ideologically. We think of fascism as a much more coherent ideology, right? So there might be fascists around the Trump administration, right, who are ideologically coherent. I'm not sure though that I see the administration as a whole kind of in that space. But I don't mean to minimize concerns, right? I just think that the immediate challenge that we're facing here is less that and more the kind of weakening of democracy that we've seen in cases of democratic backsliding like Hungary, right? So to me, am I worried about us becoming Nazi Germany? I mean, of course I'm worried. I don't think that would be good. But I think that the risk is that we become Hungary, not that we become Germany.
In regards to the Filipino data you recovered with the shootings not being next to the church and the police officers having a different opinion when it came from a religious figure, do you think those numbers and data could be emulated in Mexico in regards to the war on drugs and cartels?
Yeah, it's a great question. I haven't looked in Mexico, but we do have a chapter of, so this is a book that's going to come out within the next year or so on the Philippines case. And we have some evidence related to Brazil, where Bolsonaro did sort of similar stuff. And so we have killings data, and we have the census, and we know where the churches are located, and we ran the analysis. And we didn't find results. And it's interesting because in Brazil, the Catholic bishops are relatively progressive, actually, and have spoken out against populist violence, right, in the favelas. But what we found was, even though they spoke out at the national level, the Catholic churches in Brazil aren't located where the violence is happening. There's a strong quantitative relationship between race and economic class and where Catholic churches are located in Rio, right? Catholic churches are located in whiter areas of Rio and in wealthier areas of Rio. That's not where people are getting killed. And we think that this undermined their ability, probably, to intervene in those communities. I'm not a Brazil expert, but that's what the data, I'm very confident that's what it says. We don't see this in Manila. In Manila, the location of Catholic parishes is not correlated with socioeconomic status, right? It's unrelated to class, right? There are parishes in wealthy gated communities, absolutely. There are parishes in the mall, right? Unbelievable. But there are also parishes in urban poor communities, and there's no quantitative relationship between that. And I think that that's an important difference. Now, I don't know the Mexican case well enough to know what the data might show, but I know that in Latin America, at times, the Catholic Church was so tied to kind of post-colonial elites that it's possible that that dynamic would exist in other Latin American cases too, but I'm not sure.
I'm sure you all have more questions than we have time for, at least at the moment, but I couldn't imagine a more timely and thought-provoking lecture or encouragement for you to complement your study of politics or national studies with religion. Wink, wink. But I want to recommend again Professor Buckley's recent book, which I believe now the AU Library has in digital form if you're interested in picking up some of these themes. But please join me again in thanking Dr. Buckley for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Really great questions, and I'm happy to hang around for a little bit.